What if I told you that the latest budget change could dramatically affect your retirement plans in many ways people haven't realised? The headlines focus on minimum wage increase and the fuel duty freeze, but buried in the detail are a couple of significant changes which could reshape retirement planning as we know it. This is the biggest tax hike we've seen in a budget for, frankly, a very long time. So in this video, I want to go over the key points around it. You will have to cut me some slack here because this is very hot off the press. So I found some reasonable data points to illustrate my points, but the sources aren't as precise as I'd normally like them to be, so just bear that in mind. And just on that, before I start, just spare a thought for financial planners like me trying to guide their clients to do the right thing in the relentless noise we've had around this budget. I put some media clips up which were clearly wrong, including one which I think it was a Telegraph, I'll put it up, which said tax-free cash had in fact been cut. That was a really nice kind of heart in my chest moment today, especially after I'd just spent quite a long time making sure my clients didn't take tax-free cash because I thought it was the wrong idea. Anyway, so thankfully that proved to be right. The thing is, this has been the biggest increase in taxes in a budget since 1993, as this data from the IFS shows. Now, the last time taxes rose that much was due to a crisis, frankly, after 1993, after Black Wednesday. So there's a lot to change here. So let's dive in with the key changes that might be affecting your personal finance position. I clearly can't cover everything. I also don't intend to get political. This isn't a political channel. But I hope I can give you an idea of what the implications may be for you from a financial planning perspective. I also made some predictions in an earlier video on the budget, so I'll go over that and we can score my homework in real time, laugh at me for what I was wrong about, and do all that at the end. So the first thing I'm just going to do is list all the key budget changes on the side here, just so that you can kind of get a bit of a summary in case you missed it. And then I'm going to go into the ones which are probably going to affect your financial planning. There were some I personally welcomed. I think an increase to the minimum wage is good. Reform to the carers allowance so people can have a high level of income to support them if they're caring. I think that's a great thing. And an area, personal thing, where there was actually some reform as far as supporting women in pregnancy, in employment law and returning to work. I'm about to be a first-time dad soon. I've certainly seen the position that kind of puts on women. And let's be honest, in this country, we make it very hard for many people to have kids. So it's really not a big surprise less people are having them. Anyway, that's a whole different episode. It was welcome and I was glad to see it. So first up is capital gains tax. So just a quick recap. If you hold investments outside of a pension or an ISA and they grow in value, you will be subject to capital gains tax. When you pay tax on the gain, currently, it used to be, if you're a basic rate taxpayer, you would pay 10%. If you're a higher, that would be 20%. There is differences if it's a property, but the personal allowance as well of $12,570, you can't use that to offset any capital gain. So I had a quick look at the Gov website just shortly after the budget, and it seems the change is immediate, which was actually in line with what I was expecting. And I'll just post this thing about some data that they did about forestalling, where they looked to develop it over time. And the reason why I thought it would be immediate is because if they didn't make the changes immediate, there'd be a rush to the exit, so to speak, around capital gains. So the changes are the main rates of capital gains that apply to assets other than residential property and carried interest have gone from 10 to 20 for 10 basic and 20 to 18 for basic and 24 respectively. And that's for disposals made on or after the 30th of October 2024. So that is today. As it stands, from my understanding, having a look at the details, it does appear the annual exempt amount of $3,000 does seem to be in place. There was a bit there where it stated that. So that's the amount that you can realize on gains without incurring capital gains. And so 0%, it's basically an exempt rate. So the conclusion is, unless you were sat on very high levels of gains, there could have still been a case for kicking the can down the road on these gains until next tax years. Because if you, for example, use your £3,000 exemption, or you and your spouse do, so that's $6,000 between the two of you might still be able to sell it for next year despite the increases and still be in a better position because you've used your exemption as opposed to having the higher rate applied to you. Okay, next up is national insurance for employers. So at the moment, if you're employed, then you typically get money in your pay packet and your employer will normally pay 13.8% on national insurance on what they pay to you. So that's quite a high amount, isn't it? Anyway, there's going to be an increase in that, a 1.2 pence or 1.2% increase in employer national insurance contributions. That 13.8 is going to go to 15p from April. It is being combined with a reduction to the earnings threshold which payments begin. And they're expecting that it's going to raise 25 billion a year by 2030. So that's quite a chunk of change. Remember, they came out saying that 22 billion was the black hole. So that ultimately is going to be a big slug of it. It has been an area where that's offset slightly because the employer's allowance increased from 5,000 to 10,000. And the case is being made that it's going to impact small businesses less because they're going to increase this allowance. I think the thing that's quite natural to do is just think this isn't going to affect me, it only affects my employer. But the OBR projections state that 75% of employer national insurance increases actually will impact employees. So while it is tempting to think, screw it, it's my employer, there isn't any free lunch here. And it's quite likely that these increases will pass through to employees due to this tax rise. And now just onto general income taxes, stealth taxes. Every time I've done a video on a budget, it feels like stealth taxes has been a key thing. And I just want to hammer home the message because I think it's sometimes a bit misunderstood. So there was arguably a bit of a curveball from Reeves as far as the personal tax thresholds. So under the Tories, they were set to remain, this is the freezing of tax bands in place until 2028. And it was expected that they would continue to freeze them for another year. But actually, she said, I've concluded that extending the threshold freeze would hurt working people and it would take more money out of their pay slips. So what this means is that now from 2029, personal tax thresholds will be uprated in line with inflation once again. Hallelujah. The thing is, we as public at large shouldn't see that as necessarily a good thing or a reward. Tax rates should increase with inflation. That's the problem with stealth taxes. It preys on the fact that the human brain isn't very good and frankly, maybe financial education isn't fantastic. And so we don't generally understand the impact of inflation over time. You know, these stealth taxes have been in place since 2022. If we use an inflation calculator today, because inflation has been so high, since 2022, inflation RPI has been 16%. If we consider it up to 2028, it's very realistic that inflation over that time, the cost of goods and services, the things you have to buy, which affects your real wealth, could be 25, 30%, who knows? So I want you to bear in mind when you see any of this messaging that it's often done where it's like we're doing you a favor not increasing things. And I just don't like that because I think it does prey on the fact that people don't adjust their income expectations for inflation. On that theme, inheritance tax. And I'm going to put my cards on the table and say, I think the short-term impact of these policies may be stated, but I think the long-term impacts, I believe, is being severely underestimated. And it really is a thing that should take headlines, but I think it's not going to because it gets a bit lost in the weeds and it's quite technical. So the freeze on inheritance tax in general will continue for another 2 years until 2030. I did a video very recently, because I kind of was expecting some changes, on the rules around inheritance tax, and I've linked that to the end, and I don't actually have to change that at the moment, which is great. But the very abbreviated, too long didn't read, not going to be accurate for everyone's situation with inheritance tax is that each individual person gets a nil rate band of 325,000. If you leave a property to a direct descendant, that extends to 175,000. So now one person's got 500,000. If you're a married couple, then a combined married couple, assuming the property goes to direct descendants, can leave £1 million. Please see the other video and get advice if you're actually doing any proper inheritance tax planning. So the nil rate band has not increased since 2009. If I show you an RPI, retail price index inflation calculator, since 2009, the cost of goods and services has increased, according to this, at 86.2% over that period. Even if your assets have just kept up with inflation, and forgetting the fact that the whole idea of building wealth is that you're going above inflation with your assets, it basically means that if you have 537,000 of total assets in 2009, and they just went up with RPI, you're now nearly near the £1 million. You're nearly at a position where inheritance tax is going to be chargeable. So it's no surprise this is catching many more people. I think it's fair to say inheritance tax has gone from something that, only really the rich pay to that a lot of middle England are now going to have to pay an inheritance tax bill. And it's about to get way, way worse. Again, inherited pensions or pensions when you die are going to be brought into the inheritance tax net. This is huge. So for decades, pensions have been a key tool for passing wealth down through generations tax efficiently. Maybe it had gone too far, frankly. I'm not going to start that debate, but that's just what it's been. Now, this is about to change. In the data, they project around 8% of estates each year are going to be affected, but I personally think this is going to be much, much bigger than people think, especially going forward because of the situation we've got with auto-enrollment and house prices are the way they are. So it means even with good planning, unless we get into more complicated stuff, people who've done just well are likely probably going to get impacted by inheritance tax if you live down south. If your place where the house prices are cheaper, maybe not. Currently explain the current legislation around pensions, if you don't mind, because it'll just give me a bit of context. So currently, there's a slight difference between a defined contribution pension and a defined benefit pension. And these are just generalizations, so please seek advice if you're looking to do any proper planning. So let's do the defined benefit pension first. That is when you have a guaranteed income for life. So, let's say, for example, you're part of a defined benefit scheme, the NHS scheme, teacher's pension. Now, when you die, there is a spousal pension or a dependent's pension. Now, that spousal pension is always typically taxable at the marginal rate. So let's say it goes to your spouse and they're a 20% taxpayer, they would pay tax on that pension. Depending on whether you've died before taking the pension or after retirement, there may be a lump sum. And that lump sum typically depends on whether you died pre or post 75 on if it's going to be taxable. If it happens after 75, it's normally taxable at the recipient's marginal rate. If it happens before 75, it's normally tax-free. That age 75 is a key bit of legislation for pension death benefits. Again, there's no real clear reason why that's the case, but that has always been a really key rule. And when I used to plan for clients, I would always look at doing things like taking their tax-free cash before 75, because then if they died the day after their 75th birthday, it all then became taxable on their dependent at the marginal rate. So it kind of felt like it died with you. Okay, so now for a flexible pot. So this is a defined contribution. So maybe you've got a pension with like the Legal & General or Aegon or Royal London or whoever. It is a pot that will go up and down. Now, if you died before 75, up to the lump sum allowance, which was the old lifetime allowance of $1,073,100, that would be tax-free typically on the individual. There are also, because of the weird rules around the lump sum allowance abolishment, there were some ways where even people with very large pensions could actually leave it all entirely to the family tax-free. But we won't go into that. There's other videos you can look into that. But it could always be outside of the estate typically under trustee discretionary rules. So what you would do is you'd complete a nomination of beneficiary or an expression of wish, and then the trustees would use that to guide their decisions and pay out any benefits outside of the estate. So what that would typically mean is, let's say you have a pension worth, 500,000, 600,000, a house, because you live down south, worth 800,000. You could rest easy that, yes, you might have some stocks and shares, ISAs and cash, but your house and your assets in your estate and your pension can leave a nice bequest and ultimately not be chargeable to additional inheritance tax. The government says, and their consultation is, the government estimate that out of 213,000 estates with inheritable pensional wealth in 2027 to 2028, 10,500 estates, or around 1.5 of the total UK debt, will become liable to pay inheritance tax, where this would not previously have been the case. So that doesn't sound too bad, does it? 1.5. But that's not the point, and that's missing something huge in my view. It's not about how many estates pay it now. It's about the huge generational impact this will have over the many years going forward, especially considering the fact that inheritance tax bands haven't increased for so long. If I just show you some house price data, and again, it's based on house prices sold, it's not perfect, I've been limited on time. But if we look down south, over 40% of the properties sold were over 400,000, with quite a few being much higher. I live in London. I will show you a house for £700,000, not a million miles away from me. It doesn't get you much, is the truth. Now, I know I'm going to get hate for it, but it's just true. It's the reality of living down south. Consider that to retire on a reasonable pot of money, you want to try and build your pensions individually or combined with your partner to at least, say, 500,000. If you want to maybe retire early in state pension age and live a decent quality of life, however you define that, you are then now going to be in a position where you're going to be paying inheritance tax. And just for context, if we assume the annuity rates are, say, 4%, which might be a reasonable guide of where they'll settle long term, if you've got 500,000, that's going to give you £20,000 per year in guaranteed income. I don't think anyone watching this is going to say someone who gets 20,000 in, guaranteed income at 60 is absolutely loaded. And there will always be people who make statements of saying, yeah, you've got a pot with 500 grand to retire, you're loaded. But I think that highlights misunderstandings about how much money you actually need to retire comfortably. So what will happen each year is more and more estates will typically get caught up in IHT, and make no mistake, if you live down south or your house is worth anything substantial, you now need to be very careful on inheritance tax. So what does this mean from a planning perspective? My plans with clients are going to have to change substantially. It means that more focus is going to be on spending money in your lifetime and or gifting, maybe even more annuity planning. I will probably have conversation with my clients and just go, sack the kids, just spend it, enjoy it. I think things like trusts, which were used with some of my clients, but not as regularly because of the benefits of pensions, are going to be more and more important, especially for those with larger estates. And people who just have done well are now going to have to focus very heavily on inheritance tax. I also think there's quite a hole in legislation as far as having money saved for things like care in later life. Because people are going to be in this horrible position where it's like, okay, well, I don't really have anything near enough that if my home needed adapting, I'd be able to do it. But I'm also then in the same extent going to get caught out by inheritance tax in later life. So I think it is going to cause quite a few issues. It's going to unlock some wealth because people are going to have to sell the house. And if you're someone who can't get onto the property ladder, that might be something that you think is fair enough. Again, I'm not here to make a political point. I'm just talking through the options. So anyway, there were some other big changes around business asset disposal relief, which means if you sell a business, you get a lifetime limit of £1 million. So you sell your business and get a 10% tax rate on that million. However, rates are going to rise to 14% from April 2025 and 18% from 2026. Now, relief was originally 100% on qualifying businesses and agricultural assets, in addition to nil rate bans and exemptions from inheritance tax. The thing is, the 100% relief will continue for the first million of now combined agricultural and property relief. It's going to then be 50% after. What that means is this Labour's very low £1 million threshold for agricultural property relief means that actually quite a lot of ordinary family farms are going to get caught for inheritance tax. So I'm going to take a quote from Farmer's Guide here.
The local shop for local people. There's nothing for you here. I can pay.
I'm only joking. While I live in London now, I was a country boy when I grew up, so I've quite literally been chased by cows, so I always poke a bit of fun at them. Anyway, this states, the suggestion that most family farms won't be affected because they aren't worth over £1 million is frankly unrealistic. Farmers are often asset rich but cash poor, with an average farm value of around £3 million. So they're now looking at inheritance tax bills of approximately 400,000. I'm always mindful of this area because I know it's been an area of abuse, such as wealthy families just sheltering money via this relief with potentially no connection to actual farming. However, I also do know of people who have kind of been had generational family farms. And the idea of them potentially losing the family business over that, because guess what? A commercial farm is actually really expensive. You need a lot of land and a lot of equipment. And that feels a bit galling. And surely that's going to be negative for our country in the long run if people are having to then sell their farms because they need to pay inheritance tax bills. Just on that, actually a very quick plug if that's okay. I've recently revamped my retirement sequence email list. So if you want to get access to a download of 5 pension tax mistakes to avoid from me, which I will need to update in relation to the inheritance tax side, and I will do, alongside tips, strategies I'm using with clients to make sure that they save tax as much as possible and plan for retirement effectively, do sign up. You'll also get invites to workshops I run on my clients on big changes like inheritance tax planning changes, pension death benefits, pension tax planning. And if that's not enticing enough, I'm actually also designing a cash flow model via Excel, which I'll be giving away free to subscribers. It's not done yet, by the way, but it will be out in the next few months. So it's a great place to be if you want to retire without worry. And of course, you can always unsubscribe at any time if it's not valuable to you and your data is never shared. So what's the key message here from all the analysis? So let's have a look at my predictions and see how I got. I'm just going to have to open a different screen for this. Okay, here we go. I gave flat rate pension tax relief 20%. That didn't happen, so I'm giving my mark a tick there on my homework. National insurance on pensions. I was wrong about that. It was national insurance increase in general, so that's wrong. Pre-75 pension death benefit tax change. I'm going to say yes, I was right on that because actually it did change. It's just changed a different way. Pension death tax. I sat on the fence there. Can I give myself a mark for sitting on the fence? 50%? No, I'm going to give my mark a wrong there because I was right that got changed, but I didn't. I should actually give an opinion sometimes. 20% pension tax-free cash abolishment. Thank God that did not change. So I'm going to give myself a tick there. Investing more in the UK, I think we might need to have a look under that. I'm going to give myself a nothing there because I need to have a look into that in more details. 80% capital gains tax increase. Yep, definitely got that one right. Council tax reform, I got that one wrong. I thought that would go in and that would make change. That would be changed, but it wasn't. Inheritance tax increases, 20%. So I was actually right there. It looks like I was wrong, but I said that I didn't think the headline rate was going to increase. And it didn't. The headline rate is still 40%. However, what's happened is they've added a load of stuff into the inheritable assets for the estates. So I was right on the headline rate, but wrong on the fact they're going to go, oh, we're going to throw a ton more stuff into your estate now. So I don't know how to mark that. Okay, so in summary, there's a lot to chew over here. And a lot of it's going to impact the planning of my clients. Frankly, I kind of wish it wasn't the case that I have to be involved with stuff like this, but days like today remind me of why I'm in a job and why things can get so busy. There's a lot we're going to have to consider as far as navigating this new world, and so my clients can ideally keep as much of their hard-earned money as they can. So why don't you let me know in the comments, did you feel this budget was fair? Was it as bad as expected? Why don't you have a look at the inheritance tax overview video I did, because it will give you an idea of how the bands all work. Anyway, I'm off to go and change 90 cash flow plans. See you next time.